US President Donald Trump has begun his five-nation tour of Asia with an ambitious agenda to tackle trade, territorial issues and North Korea's nuclear weapons program. And the first stop on the itinerary is Japan. Trump had a captive audience when he delivered this message shortly after touchdown.
No dictator, no regime, and no nation should underestimate ever American resolve.
The President and Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe have put on a public display of mutual affection. This is an alliance both parties want to strengthen.
トランプ大統領との2人の友情の上に、信頼関係の上に、日米同盟の絆をさらに確固たるものにしていきたいと思います。また、北朝鮮情勢をはじめ、国際的なさまざまな課題についてじっくりと。
Abe says Japan will issue new sanctions against 35 groups and individuals with ties to Kim Jong-un's regime. He says it's to resolve Pyongyang's abductions of Japanese nationals and North Korea's weapons program. Trump has hinted at pursuing a less diplomatic course of action.
The era of strategic patience is over.
In the lead-up to Donald Trump's visit to South Korea, Seoul has been displaying its military might. President Moon Jae-in has made it clear his country will never have nuclear weapons, and it won't tolerate Pyongyang having them either. What Moon does want is a diplomatic solution to denuclearize the peninsula.
어떠한 경우에도 한반도에서 무력 충돌은 안 됩니다. 한반도에서 대한민국의 사전 동의 없는.
Since Kim Jong-un came to power, North Korea's nuclear capacity has skyrocketed. In response, the international community has ramped up financial sanctions on the regime. But ahead of Trump's visit to Asia, the North Korean government demanded an end to what it says are brutal sanctions violating the human rights of its citizens. The Pentagon says a ground invasion is the only way to destroy North Korea's nuclear weapons program. However, a military conflict could affect up to 25 million people on both sides of the demilitarized zone. But as Trump travels around the region, will he push for that option, regardless of what North Korea's neighbors want? Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Medford, Massachusetts is Sung-Yoon Lee. He's a professor of Korean Studies at Tufts University in Washington. We have Scott Snyder. He's a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. And from Taipei, Ross Darrell Feingold. He's the former chairman for Republicans Abroad in Asia and an advisor on strategic communications for governments and organizations in the region. Gentlemen, I thank you very much for joining us. Scott Snyder, let me begin with you. What have you made of Trump's visit to Asia thus far?
I think that President Trump has gotten off to a pretty good start. This is probably the easiest stop in his visit. He had a chance to play golf with Prime Minister Abe and also to have in-depth discussions about North Korea, about trade, about the idea of an open Indo-Pacific region. And those are all issues where Prime Minister Abe and President Trump have substantial agreement. They've had a press conference and he had a visit with the emperor. And so I think that he's moving into the harder parts of the visit with some momentum. He has a state visit coming up in South Korea and also in China before he goes to Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be straddling a bunch of these issues from Japan to South and North Korea to China and beyond. On the Japan note, Ross Darrell Feingold, Trump has said the two countries have never been closer. Is that true?
Well, it's probably something every American president would say when they're visiting Japan. The fact is, post-World War II, the two countries have had a very close trade and security relationship, and that's continued whether it's Democrats or Republicans. But there is an important reality here, to be fair to President Trump, which is he has established a very strong personal rapport with Prime Minister Abe, and I don't think it would be fair to deny that. And it does contrast a bit with his predecessor, President Obama, who was known for having more distant relationships with foreign leaders. He wasn't really someone who liked to go golfing and chat and schmooze with the foreign leaders the way his predecessor did, George W. Bush. And we see that Donald Trump does enjoy that personal aspect. And hopefully it's good for the bilateral relationship of the two countries.
Yeah. Sung-Young Lee, when Donald Trump said no one, no dictator, no regime should underestimate American resolve, I'm assuming he's referring very directly to Kim Jong-un. He said that in Japan. How did that go down in the region?
President Trump also said that the US and Japan and South Korea need to be united in their strong stance against North Korea. The Japanese Prime Minister replied that talks for the sake of talks is no good at this point. It's time to put more financial pressure on North Korea. And that led to Mr. Trump's response that, yes, we need to make North Korea recalculate its interests and return to talks and change policy. That is a truism that is loaded with a message toward the South Korean president on the eve of Trump's visit to the country. Why? Because Trump and the South Korean president, Mr. Moon, fundamentally have different views on how to approach North Korea. The South Korean leader is very much pro-engagement, even unconditional engagement, and we know that the U.S. right now is opposed to that. So there's bound to be friction, underlying tension between Moon and Trump when they meet in a few hours.
Yeah, Ross Darrell Feingold, I mean, isn't there a good point there, whereas the South Koreans are saying, hey, we have to live here. You can talk about locked and loaded and fire and fury and have all the threats you want to have and direct them towards North Korea, but we have to live in this neighborhood and we have to deal with the potential fallout, so tone it down. Can you understand that fundamental difference between the South Koreans and President Trump when it comes to North Korea?
Well, if there is a distance, it's closed, because President Moon ran on a relatively left-of-center campaign seeking accommodation with North Korea. And this is at a time when President Trump had already taken office. And we see that in the few months after President Moon's inauguration, that he's taken a somewhat more conservative line with North Korea. He has allowed the deployment of the THAAD missile batteries. He has allowed for substantial joint military exercises between South Korea and the United States. And we have President Trump's visit now. So the relationship is good. It's not the same as the relationship that Abe and President Trump have. But it does seem clear that the pattern is more to accommodate the United States' expectations on security issues rather than to go at it alone. Because the South Korean government also knows that they cannot go at it alone. They cannot have bilateral talks with North Korea without involving the other stakeholders, such as the United States and Japan. Right. And that's a reality that President Moon is confronting.
Yeah, Scott Snyder, who has to reassure or accommodate whom more? South Korea to the U.S. or the U.S. to South Korea?
Well, I think that basically Trump and Moon end up being in this together. Moon really has no choice but to follow Trump's lead in terms of pressuring North Korea. I don't think that there's going to be a possibility that South Korea can independently approach North Korea. At the same time, for President Moon, his own domestic situation requires him to maintain the alliance with the United States as best he can, and I think that's also a constraint that Moon faces.
Right. Let me talk about the elephant in the room, or rather maybe even the dragon in the room. Sung-Young Lee, is Trump's relationship with China and are his conversations with China going to be supremely crucial to figuring out how everybody's going to move forward vis-a-vis North Korea? Because his chats with China, his chats with Xi Jinping are going to happen down the road. We're not going to get any indication right now.
President Trump also mentioned economic issues with respect to U.S.-Japan trade, U.S.-China trade, and left out South Korea in that equation. When Moon and Trump met in D.C. in late June with the South Korean president right next to him, President Trump, used strong words like a fair shake, fair burden sharing. South Korea has to stop enabling dumped steel entering American markets and so on. So Trump is sending on multiple fronts the message that he is very much dedicated to pursuing a more equitable trade relationship with China and South Korea. At the same time, trade issues are, of course, very important, but they pale in comparison in the context of state-to-state relations to security issues like North Korea's growing nuclear threat. So yes, Trump will bring up economic issues with Xi, but will mostly focus on trying to persuade Xi to put more meaningful pressure on North Korea, and probably that exhortation will fall on deaf ears but a smiley face. President Xi is now poised to be the next paramount leader for probably the next decade. I don't think Xi would be rattled by Trump's pressure or even exhortation.
Yeah, poised to be the paramount leader for the next decade. Interestingly put, Ross Feingold, is Trump visiting Asia at a time when Xi Jinping is fast replacing him as the most powerful man in the world?
Well, it's an excellent question because of the different kinds of angles that people approach this issue. On the one hand, we see plenty of analysts and media speculating that Asian leaders are worried. They're worried about Donald Trump's style. They're worried that he's focused on domestic issues. They're worried that the United States is not invested in the region. On the other hand, when the United States does show that it's invested in the region, such as by trade negotiations, by bilateral meetings, and some of these Asian leaders have already been to the United States to meet with President Trump, and now President Trump's here. So when the United States takes moves to show that it is invested in the region, then we get criticism that, people don't really like Donald Trump, so maybe they don't want him to be here. The reality is that the United States is deeply involved in this region, and it's not something that arose under President Obama, even though he put a marketing name on it, calling it the rebalance or the pivot. The George W. Bush administration, the Clinton administration, George H.W. Bush, U.S. governments have been heavily invested in Asia continuously for decades. And Donald Trump is continuing that. And generally speaking, just like in other parts of the world, despite media criticism of United States policies under both Democrat and Republican presidents, the reality is that governments in Asia, potentially with the exception of China, do welcome a heavy U.S. presence, whether it's through trade or security or other initiatives of the United States. So Donald Trump's visit is certainly something that's welcomed by Asian leaders.
Yeah, well, let me take an adjusted version of that question and ask Scott Snyder. Obama pivoted to Asia. Is Trump visiting Asia at a time when he is weaker as U.S. president than Obama was? And in fact, China might be calling the shots.
I don't think that President Trump is necessarily weaker than President Obama was, but I do think that he has a challenge in terms of his messaging in Asia, because he goes to Asia with this America First message. At the same time, we need our allies. We need the security network that the U.S. leads. And there are risks with allies that America's first can be interpreted as leaving the allies behind. And in fact, I think that what all the parties in the Asia-Pacific want is to know that the U.S. has staying power as they see China's rise. They want the U.S. to continue to be involved in security in the region. And President Trump does have a message about a free and open Indo-Pacific region, which is a substitute for the rebalance, but we'll just have to wait and see how that plays out during the course of the trip.
Right, Sung-Young Lee, so let's see how this might play out down the line. So Trump visits Asia, he talks tough on North Korea, he strengthens his alliances with multiple players in the region. The US and South Korea conduct drills as they always have. The North see it as a provocation. They launch a missile or two. Everybody freaks out again. Rinse and repeat. Is this how this cycle is going to continue to repeat itself because of the nuclear deterrence?
Well, that's been the pattern for 25 years now, and it's likely to go on because the fundamental dynamics are still in place in which China relentlessly supports, gives aid to North Korea, especially in particular in the wake of a North Korean provocation like a nuclear test. Now, I already give Mr. Trump high marks, although there's really a high possibility that he will go on to make a series of faux pas, perhaps even make disparaging remarks in South Korea or China or Vietnam or the Philippines, but simply to show up, and not only to show up, but spend 12 days on a visit to East Asia, which is the longest by a US president in some 25 years. Simply showing up sends the message that the US is involved in Asian affairs and does care about not only allies, but other small countries in Southeast Asia that feel rather threatened by China. The comedian Woody Allen said, 90% of success is simply showing up. So Trump is doing the right thing because America first sounds grand, but to win your constituency in terms of domestic politics as you lose much of Asia to China is surely to be America second.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, he is going to be showing up. Scott Snyder, he's not expected to be slapping anyone on the wrist in terms of human rights. That's the expectation. We'll wait and see if it unfolds differently. But when he goes to Manila or Hanoi or Beijing, he's not expected to say, hey, stop locking up dissidents, or hey, Duterte, stop the extrajudicial killings. Is that just a more honest way of doing realpolitik from a US president and not faking it anymore, or does that diminish America's standing?
Well, I see President Trump as an outlier and not in the mainstream necessarily on how to deal with the human rights issue. It certainly contains elements of realpolitik. I actually think that the more interesting and bigger issue where we can see potential frictions or challenge is on this bilateral focus on fair and reciprocal trade. And so that's, I think, the area where every country that Trump visits is going to feel like it is under a certain amount of pressure to readjust their bilateral merchandise trade relationships with the United States. And based on what he has said in the United States and with his core constituency, I think that's actually the issue that he's going to have to be able to make some progress on.
Ross Feingold, human rights or fair and unfair trade? Which do you expect to be a more, potentially a bigger flashpoint?
Well, we have to keep in mind that President Trump and these leaders that he will engage with, whether bilateral or in the multilateral meetings, they're only together for very limited amounts of time. And there are a lot of issues that they will discuss, whether it's trade or security. And there are things they will discuss behind closed doors that we can only speculate whether human rights will come up. We also have to keep in mind that we haven't even covered in this conversation all the other issues that are on the agenda, an important one being terrorism and specifically anti-terrorism cooperation. And frankly, that's probably a higher priority when he meets with the Philippines than when it is when he meets with other countries. So there are just a number of issues that are on the agenda and time constraints. But when it comes to human rights, President Trump, and not just human rights, but religious freedom as well. President Trump has been outspoken about this issue. He probably doesn't get enough credit. And if he's not, there's actually a lot of people in Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, who do look very closely on these issues. And they're also keeping a close eye on the administration's efforts in this area. So if President Trump is remiss, he'll certainly have Congress looking at this issue.
Yeah. Professor Sung-Young Lee, if we could sum it up in a nutshell, I know it's more than half the population of the planet, but if I had to ask you, what does Asia right now want from Donald Trump? What would you say?
Asia, especially the medium-sized and small countries in the region, want visible, palpable commitment by the United States that the U.S. has not pivoted back away from Asia and is so preoccupied with domestic politics alone. China is, of course, a growing power, and that presents some opportunities for some countries in the region to improve their relations with China. At the same time, great powers tend to bully the smaller powers, peripheral powers in the region. So a lot of states in the region are concerned about China's growing aggression and look to the United States as an ameliorating force. Human rights is very important, but even, Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, making her first visit overseas in that position. When asked about human rights, would she bring up in China, she said something that didn't need to be said. She said trade relations are more important than human rights. I don't expect Trump to focus on human rights, although he should, especially with respect to North Korea. North Korea's crimes against humanity, according to a landmark UN study, purportedly has no parallel in the contemporary world. It's a shame that the South Korean leadership and the American leaders are really not speaking out on this very grave issue in North Korea.
Okay, gentlemen, unfortunately I've got to wrap, so we'll put a button on it there, but I appreciate your abilities and intellects to juggle multiple issues here. It's been a fascinating discussion with all of you. Sung-Yoon Lee, Ross, Daryl Feingold, and Scott Snyder. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.